Order, please. Before we begin the day routine, the subject for this evening's late debate was submitted by the Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic. Be it resolved that Liberals who ran in 1999 on a policy of dramatically increasing the provincial debt and Liberals who are running in 2003 on a policy of decreasing the public debt must explain why Nova Scotians should believe them now. Be debated this evening at 6 p.m. We'll begin the day routine presenting reading petitions. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition. The petition reads as such: the petition on safety and quality of care for RRSS residents. Whereas 250 residential councillors working with the Regional Residential Services Society provides a high quality of care and support to approximately 200 intellectually challenged adults over the age of 18 in the Halifax Regional Municipality. And whereas these members of the Nova Scotia Government and General Employees Union have been attempting for over a year to negotiate a new collective agreement that would establish wage parity for them and their counterparts who do the same work in institutions. And whereas they have been forced to withdraw their services on April the 10th after both RRSS and the government rejected at least 4 different proposals from NSGEU to resolve these outstanding issues without any disruption to services to the residents. And whereas the family members of the councillors are very concerned about the safety and quality of care of residents that are being provided through the current contingency arrangements by RRSS. The operative clause, therefore, be it resolved that we, the undersigned family members, councillors, and others concerned persons...
Order, please. Do you know, member reading the petition or a resolution?
I'm reading the petition.
It's not the proper format for a petition.
Well, we'll just do the operative clause.
The accepted principle, I guess, in this House for a petition obviously was to be short and to the point, so that's a format used for resolution in the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Then I will do refrain to the operative clause. And the operative clause therefore be it resolved that we, the undersigned family members, councillors, and other concerned persons call on the Ham government to show that it cares about the residents of Regional Residential Services Society by giving that agencies a mandate and appropriate funding to negotiate wage parity for their residential councillors as soon as possible, Mr. Speaker, and I have affixed my name and signature to the petition.
Petition is tabled. The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition bearing the signature of 38 family members, councillors, and other concerned persons who are concerned about the ongoing strike at Regional Residential Services, and the operative clause of which reads, therefore be it resolved that we, the undersigned family members, councillors, and other concerned persons call on the Ham government to show that it cares about the residents of the Regional Residential Services Society by giving that agency a mandate and appropriate funding to negotiate wage parity for their residential councillors as soon as possible. And Mr. Speaker, I have fixed my name to that petition as well.
Table. Presenting report. Sorry, now Member Clare on the petition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the residents living near Highway 101 in Digby County between the villages of Conway and Weymouth, I beg leave to table a petition that reminds the government of its commitment to limited access on this portion of the highway. The operative phrase states, this section of highway contains the school, post offices, several convenience stores, and churches, in addition to many residences. This road is extensively utilized by logging trucks, heavy equipment, large transport vehicles, and tourist traffic. Our lives are greatly affected by the tragic accidents on this stretch of highway, and we fear for the safety of our children as they wait for and travel on school buses. We live in danger on a daily basis. Mr. Speaker, there's 150 concerned citizens here, and I will affix my name to this petition as well. Thank you.
Petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia is committed to protecting workers in Nova Scotia. Over the past few years, we have made important improvements to our health and safety regimes, Mr. Speaker. We have updated the province's Occupational Health and Safety Act and our first aid regulations and introduced occupational health and Safety General Regulations. We have taken steps to enhance awareness and understanding through the development of plain language guides, videos, and presentations for both employers and employees. We have brought greater emphasis on education and preventative initiatives by moving this responsibility to the Workers' Compensation Board, where it will be governed by both employers and employees who have a direct interest in reducing accidents in the workplace. We have also worked hard to bring harmonization to federal and provincial laws on occupational health and safety, because we believe that Nova Scotia's offshore workers should have the same kind of protection afforded to their counterparts onshore. Current protection for offshore workers is a responsibility of the Canadian Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board, which reports to both the federal and provincial governments. And while this system, Mr. Speaker, offers a considerable degree of protection, we believe the ultimate solution must be the delivery of legislation that is supported by Nova Scotia, Canada, and Newfoundland and Labrador. We have been working diligently on this legislation with our partners for some time. And after more than 3 years of work by three governments, we are now coming to a conclusion. Just last week, we released a consultation document with details on how we propose to proceed. This is available at www.offshoreohs.ca. This proposed legislation takes the appropriate and best provision of the laws from 3 different occupational health and safety regimes to create a single regime that is adaptable to deal with the unique circumstances of the offshore. In general terms, we believe that the current draft achieves our objectives, but we are also having discussions with stakeholders to be sure we have it right. Some groups, including the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour, have already made suggestions for improvements. And other groups, like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, have indicated that more time is required to do a thorough review for such important legislation. We are continuing to work closely with all our stakeholders to ensure the system will work as expected with full and proper accountability. I'm pleased to inform you, Mr. Speaker, and my colleagues that we expect these discussions and consultations to come to a successful conclusion later this spring. Final government approvals and legal drafting would then be completed over the summer and a bill brought forward this fall. As you know, the government has been very attentive to this issue, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the government of Nova Scotia had hoped and was prepared to table a bill during this spring sitting of the legislature. However, as one would imagine, any initiative that involves 3 governments and 2 levels of government can be very complex and has taken longer than we had originally expected. So until such time when the new system is in place, the present regulatory framework will continue. Offshore health and safety continues to be carefully regulated. Workplace rights and responsibilities continue to be enforced and continue to protect workers in one of the most important emerging workplaces for Nova Scotians. With the development of this legislation in consultation with our stakeholders, we will enshrine these current practices into law. And, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your attention this morning.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to begin by thanking the minister for sending a copy of his statement over to our office. And, Mr. Speaker, that's where my kind words to the minister end. Because, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that I can ever remember government sinking to deeper cynical depth, Mr. Speaker, in terms of its political gains. Mr. Speaker, when the minister said that this government has been very attentive to the occupational health and safety issues, and particularly in the offshore, Mr. Speaker, I was looking at him very closely to see if his nose was growing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have had commitment after commitment by this government I need not remind this minister or the premier, they were both in this House in the days of Westray, Mr. Speaker. They were both members of the government that made commitments that this issue was going to be addressed. I've got a stack of press reports here, Mr. Speaker, talking about what this government was going to do. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure members of this House remember the very tragic death of Sean Hatcher in April of 1999. And Mr. Speaker, we will remember that government departments in the provincial government, like the Department of Labour, wanted charges laid. But instead, Mr. Speaker, the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board said they would rather continue to work with the companies rather than prosecuting them. And this government said, and we were told in the Human Resources Committee of this House in February of 2000 that new legislation and new regulations were coming forth within 6 months. Instead, what we're being told today, again on the eve of an election, they are re-announcing basically what they had announced before, only now they're saying, we'll do it after the election has been held. I wish you could do it before too, Mr. Minister, and I wish you had done it already. Nova Scotians and those who work and whose lives and their families, Mr. Speaker, in the offshore, they wish you had done it before. We had a bill introduced previously by the now Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries when he was occupying the energy, what is now called the energy portfolio. And what did he do, Mr. Speaker? He gave, his plan was to give control and regulation over that occupational health and safety to that very body, the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board. That legislation died on the order paper. And now the government is saying they've got a discussion paper out there. And groups like the Federation of Labour were given really 1 week's notice to respond. And what do they discover, Mr. Speaker? One of the things that's discovered is who will be overseeing it but another promoter. You know, we heard the concerns about the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board being the regulator, as they are also the promoters in the offshore. Well, now we are hearing that they're proposing that the energy minister, who is a promoter, be the regulator, Mr. Speaker. It isn't rocket science. If the government was truly committed to moving forward with this, and I'm sure that those in Ottawa and Newfoundland, the citizens there, are as concerned as we are, we would have had legislation introduced into this House and passed as the government had committed to do 3 years ago. And Mr. Speaker, for the government to stand up here and try to pat themselves on the back, now as they head into an election saying, now we're consulting and we will do something after the election. Mr. Speaker, that is pathetic. That is cynical politics at its worst. Nova Scotian workers, Nova Scotia families deserve to have the legislation on the floor of this House and in effect. They deserve it. It should be there now, Mr. Speaker, not after some date which a premier, I'm sure, has already decided on to go out and to meet the voters in the province. This announcement today is really nothing more than to try to push another potential issue off the table, get it out of the public view before the government goes to the polls, because they want to pretend that they truly do care and that they're doing something, Mr. Speaker. I say through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, to the Minister who made the announcements, and all members of the Tory caucus, shame on you for not having moved forward well before now in a concrete way on this extremely important issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too echo many of the comments that have been made by the previous speaker, and I do acknowledge the fact that the minister has sent a copy of his statement to our office earlier in the day. The minister has indicated that there's a website for this particular initiative, www.canada offshore.ca. Well, I think they should rename it www.slowpoke.com, because the reality is, Mr. Speaker, in 1999, shortly after that terrible tragedy with the death of Mr. Hatcher, all stakeholders came together and realized that the province of Nova Scotia's hands were tied and incapable of enforcing the occupational health and safety laws of this province as they should apply to the offshore. Now, we all acknowledge the collaborative effort, the federal government, the Newfoundland government, and the province of Nova Scotia. And it can be, and it is, a complex and a long drawn-out process. But, Mr. Speaker, as I recall, the draft legislation was prepared in the spring of 1999, ready to go to the respective stakeholders. Now, that's 4 years ago. 4 years ago, Mr. Speaker, and we haven't even seen the light of day on that legislation, either in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, or in Ottawa. And the question you have to ask is, why not? Mr. Speaker, I think it's patently unfair. I think to have the Offshore Petroleum Board continue to take ownership of enforcing the occupational health and safety laws of this offshore development project is simply wrong. It's like putting a weasel in charge of the chicken house and expecting fresh eggs in the morning. It's just not appropriate, Mr. Speaker. And what the government seems to be doing here today is doing a little public relations to create the appearance of something being done. Now, if what the minister is saying is correct, that this will be done in the very near future, then fine. But now he's talking about further consultation and review over the summer months. Well, he knows full well that we'll be well into an election process. The Premier is pretty well committed the province to that on a number of occasions. So we're not going to see any legislation before this House until the fall at the very earliest. We'll be well into year 5 since this issue was initially drafted, Mr. Speaker. I think that's unfair, and given the fact that there is growing concern in the business community and the labor community across this province, and in particular in the offshore for worker safety, that the government has gone soft. The government has gone soft in enforcing occupational health and safety laws of this province. Now, that's an issue to which we'll speak on a future day. But I believe, Mr. Speaker, my points have been noted, and I would respectfully submit that the Premier and the Minister responsible for this file be a little more proactive and take action now, not wait another 6 months before the delayed discussions continue.
Thank you. Any further statements by ministers? Government notice the motion. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Racing Against Drugs is a new community-based drug awareness program which catches the attention of elementary school children and warns them of the pitfalls of drugs, tobacco, and alcohol. And whereas offered by the RCMP in conjunction with Addiction Services, Racing Against Drugs is an interactive program which uses a model race car track to capture the children's imagination, taking them around the track past 8 pit stops which relay information kids need to know. Whereas this program is available to any school in the province and is offered free of charge. Therefore, be it resolved that all members commend programs like Racing Against Drugs for raising children's awareness of the harmful effects of tobacco, drugs, and alcohol, and encourage elementary schools to consider this program as a means to get these messages across to children. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. Notice the motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Liberal leader and the Liberals in this House continue to chastise the Tory government for continuing its long tradition of driving Nova Scotia deeper into debt, and whereas the Liberals' own track record on debt reduction shows their current claims of being physically responsible party are peppered with hypocrisy, and whereas on April 22nd, the NDP government of Manitoba produced its 4th consecutive balanced budget, and the NDP's fiscal responsibility has been recognized in financial circles as its credit rating is higher today than in 1999, having been recently upgraded by Moody's Investor Services to AA2, tied for 2nd in Canada. Therefore, be it resolved that the Liberal members of the House congratulate the Manitoba NDP for their ongoing fiscal prudence and regret their own legacy of debt mismanagement that has so burdened today's Nova Scotia families. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of passage without
Here
debate.
no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution.
More to come.
Whereas on February 27th of this year, the member for Kings North accused an unnamed cabinet minister of lying as part of his paid column in a local newspaper, and whereas in today's column the member names many cabinet ministers and talks about how ministers avoid questions from the opposition in supply debate and by doing so disrespects the whole process, and whereas instead of making accusations against these ministers, the member justifies the stonewalling and the lack of information provided by ministers by accusing opposition members of liking to hear the sounds of their own voices. Therefore, be it resolved, the members from Kings North recognize that supply debate is the essence of parliamentary democracy that should not be taken lightly by glib cabinet ministers who tell Nova Scotians that they have to ferret out information instead of providing the information they are duty-bound to provide.
Notice is tabled. The honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas talented Dartmouth artist Don McNutt will have a bronze piece entitled Wisteria 2 included in the 75th anniversary Canadian Sculpture Exhibition. Whereas the exhibition will open in Toronto this summer, and then in September it will travel to China for the Changchun International Sculpture Conference and on to 6 other Chinese cities. And whereas Ms. McNutt's work will also be exhibited this year at the Westport Art Center in Connecticut, the Brown Grotta Gallery in New York, and the Fog Forest Gallery in Sackville, New Brunswick, therefore be it resolved that members of this House join me in congratulating Dawn McNutt on having her work chosen as part of the 75th anniversary Canadian Sculpture Exhibition and wish her continued success in her artistic endeavors. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas hockey is our national pastime and for many a true obsession. Whereas girls hockey has become a force of its own, attracting a lot of attention from hockey fans, even plaudits from renowned Don Cherry, and Canadian women won gold this year in Olympic hockey. And whereas on March 30th, 2003, the East Hants Penguin Pee Wee girls won the 2003 provincial title in overtime in front of hundreds of cheering fans in the Lance Arena. Therefore, be resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the organizers of the very successful Pee Wee provincial tournament and the hometown East Hants Penguin Pee Wee girls and their coaches on winning the 2003 provincial Pee Wee girls hockey championship. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver notice and passage without debate.
Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, hereby give notice in future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas with the establishment of an Office of Health Promotion, this government stated that it will spearhead a number of new efforts to improve the health and fitness of Nova Scotians. And whereas earlier this week I asked the Health Promotion Minister to prove that he was committed to improving the health of Nova Scotians by listing the new initiatives his office would support and fund for the coming year. And whereas in response the minister stated, and I quote, "Indeed, the list is so long I will have to write them down on paper and send them to the member," end of quote. Therefore, it be resolved that this minister remember the Conservative government promise to be open and accountable and supply the members of this House with the list of the new initiatives his office will support this year. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for a waiver of notice and passage.
Request for waivers is agreed. Here a no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas, without losing a single game, River John resident Charles Thompson has coached the Tatamagouche Titans to the top at the provincial midget AA championship.
Hear, hear.
And whereas Mr. Thompson has also competed in the provincial tournament as a player for 4 times, with his team placing second. Whereas Mr. Thompson has been honored with an award from the Don St. John Fundy Zone representative for minor hockey in recognition of his outstanding service to this sport. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House join me in congratulating Coach Charles Thompson on his team's outstanding win at the Provincial Midget AA Championship and wish him continued success in his coaching endeavors. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Skills Canada, Nova Scotia recently held its 6th annual competition for students in the technical trades, and whereas students from across the province competed in trades such as electrical, carpentry, cosmetology, forestry, graphic design, and print media. And whereas David Sudworth of New Waterford and a student at Memorial Composite High School won gold in the Electrical Construction Division skill competition. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House congratulate Dave Sudworth of New Waterford on winning the Provincial Electrical Construction Division skill competition and wish him well in Waterloo, Ontario, where he will compete against the best across Canada in the national finals. I seek waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the influence coal mining has made to the development and culture of Cape Breton Island, specifically Glace Bay and surrounding areas, has been depicted at the Cape Breton Miners Museum. And whereas the federal government has given the museum $1.4 million to complete Phase 1 of the improvements slated to be completed in June of this year, in addition to the $2.4 million the federal government has announced for Phase 2 of reconstruction. And whereas at the end of Phase 1, the Miners Museum Foundation will begin a national campaign to find a corporate sponsor to assist with the $8.4 million Phase 2 of renovations to ensure the rich history of coal mining is preserved for future generations. Therefore, be it resolved, members of this legislature congratulate the Miners Museum Foundation for the tremendous work they've done to preserve a large part of Nova Scotia's history. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the trio Coping, the latest pop rock sensation to emerge from Pictou County, recently recorded their 2nd album, The Song Remains True, a follow-up of their debut album from 1998 entitled Retrogressive. And whereas together since 1997, the band consists of Jeff Long, singer and guitarist, Dan Stewart, bassist, and Steve Keogh on drums. And whereas Coping, which was nominated at this year's East Coast Music Awards for the Best Rock Group, have played the influential Five and Dime stage at the Marquee Club in Halifax and been hailed one of the strongest original pop bands on the East Coast.
Wow.
Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Pictou County's Coping on the release of their 2nd full album, The Song Remains True, and wish them success as they surely become one of the major players on the East Coast music scene. And I seek waiver of notice, Mr. Speaker.
Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be asking for waiver and passage without debate. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Canada Book Week runs from the 21st of April to the 27th, with national and local events held across the country. Whereas this year's theme, Literary Landscapes and Literary Sites, highlights the importance that particular places have played and continue to play in the development of Canadian literature, whereas Nova Scotia's own George Eliot Clark is one of the 9 writers commissioned to write about some of the unique places that make up our country. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House join in celebrating Canada Book Week and the talent and achievements of our many local and countrywide writers who enrich our literary heritage and strengthen our cultural foundations. I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas after today's column in a local paper, the member from Kings North is demonstrating a lack of knowledge and respect for the basis of parliamentary democracy, which is voting on and debate on supply. Whereas cabinet ministers of this government have also treated the process poorly by not coming forward with all the information Nova Scotians need to demonstrate that this is a legitimate budget. And whereas Nova Scotians are tired of ferreting out information that should have been made available by a supposedly open and accountable government, but instead they are forced to pay outrageous fees for information that is usually less than complete. Therefore, be it resolved that the member for Kings North has lifted the veil on a government that treats parliamentary process like a joke and who have flagrantly broken their promise to be open and accountable, but unfortunately the veil of secrecy goes on.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice, and on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Alberta Dumas, the volunteer coordinator with the Annapolis County RCMP Detachment's Community Assistance Program, has been dedicated to the RCMP and victims of crime for years. And whereas in recognition of this dedication, the RCMP and Annapolis County Detachment held an appreciation dinner in her honor, acknowledging her valuable efforts. And whereas the commanding officer of the RCMP in Nova Scotia awarded Ms. Dumas with a certificate of appreciation, as did the local offices in Bridgetown and Middleton, thanking her for both her tirelessness and compassion. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize Alberta Dumas for the important efforts she has made in Annapolis County through her work with victims of crime and the RCMP's Community Assistance Program. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to add, I just realized this morning that Ms. Dumas passed away on Tuesday.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for 30 years, Harold Northrup has served as a volunteer auxiliary RCMP constable with the Cole Harbour RCMP office. Whereas for 3 years, the Cole Harbour RCMP has presented the George Hawkins Frank Carriere Memorial Fellowship Award for service beyond the call of duty, and whereas this certificate of service achievement for 3 consecutive years has been awarded unanimously to Harold Northrup. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate Harold Northrup, Voluntary Auxiliary RCMP Constable in Cole Harbour, on winning the esteemed George Hawkins Frank Carriere Memorial Fellowship Award, and commend him for his extraordinary dedication and commitment to community and to the Cole Harbour RCMP Detachment. I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice in a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas unseeded tennis player Bill Buckland of Sydney earned his place in the consolation final of the 2003 Canadian Indoor Senior Tennis Championships by disposing of the number 4 seeded Alan Kerr of Toronto 6-4, 6-3 in semifinal play last Saturday night. And whereas Mr. Buckland knocked off Peter Small of Toronto in the consolation final 6-3, 6-4 Sunday morning. And whereas Mr. Buckland also played in doubles at the Nationals with Abraham Motif of Toronto and advanced to the quarterfinals before losing 7-6, 6-3. Therefore, be it resolved that all members congratulate Mr. Buckland on a successful 2003 Canadian Indoor Senior Tennis Championship. I would ask for waiver.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Bedford Basin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year a third-party assessment of Canada's businesses takes place, and Canada's 50 best managed companies are named. And whereas companies are judged on their ability to adapt to today's changing market in terms of technology, globalization, leadership, branding, and the new generation of workers. Whereas this year, several Atlantic Canadian companies were on this prestigious list, including Halifax's own Down East Communications, owned and operated by Mickey McDonald. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House commend Mr. McDonald and the staff of Down East Communications on being named to the prestigious Canada's 50 Best Managed Companies list and wish them continued success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Manitoba NDP government has reduced tuition fees by 10%, increased student debt relief, and now offer $1,000 to each employer, creating a co-op job for Manitoba graduates. And whereas the Manitoba NDP government offers seniors property tax relief that increases annually and which is worth more than twice the shrinking amount provided by the Nova Scotia Tories. And whereas the Manitoba NDP government's latest tax relief targeted property taxpayers and middle-income earners with no tax cut in the 2003 budget for those in the highest tax brackets, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Tories should heed the NDP in Manitoba and in Nova Scotia, who urge a better deal for today's families. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
For waiver, there are several noes. The honourable member for Dartmouth East on two introductions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to make an introduction to a group in the West Gallery today from Bridgewater High School. 34 grade 12 students. They're accompanied by their leaders Chuck LeCain, Charles Williamson, Sandy Bergeron, and Nancy Varner. And I would ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome of the host, and I think they'll see part of the question period. Thank you.
Certainly welcome our guest to the gallery today, the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in a bizarre answer to a question on Sunday shopping this week, the Premier went on to talk about the Blue Book and the debt. And whereas the debt is important and the Premier should know that Sunday shopping is a different issue. And whereas obviously the Premier is lacking an up-to-date set of salvage your integrity style briefing notes that would explain the difference between the broken debt promise and the broken Sunday shopping promise. Therefore, be it resolved, the Premier requests an up-to-date set of salvage your integrity style briefing notes to help him explain why he broke his Sunday shopping promise, which would be different from the set of notes that try to explain away his broken debt promise.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Sackville Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Brian Bailey was awarded a life membership to the Springfield Lake Recreation Association at the annual meeting this spring, and whereas Brian has been a tireless volunteer in his community and active in many ways over recent years, and whereas Brian's recognition by his peers shows the deep gratitude the association holds for its hard-working volunteers, therefore be it resolved this House congratulate Brian Bailey of Middle Sackville for the honour of having his efforts recognized by a life membership to the Springfield Lake Recreation Association. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Harry Smith, noted philanthropist and former resident of Shubenacadie, was the kind of citizen any community would boast of having. And whereas the Queen's Jubilee Medal was struck to be awarded to such notable individuals as Harry Smith. And whereas Mr. Smith will be awarded posthumously the Queen's Jubilee Medal on May 5th, 2003 at the Harry Smith Tin Shop Museum in Shubenacadie, one of his many gifts to the community. Therefore, be resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the organizers of the Queen's Jubilee Medal posthumous presentation on May 5th, 2003 in Shubenacadie to honor their illustrious former resident and friend, Harry Smith. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the member for Kings North envisages himself as an intellectual guru on political science and behaviorism, and whereas this member's myopic view on the general principles of responsible government are demonstrated in his regular columns of the Daily News, and whereas this member claims, quote, style defines the debater, unquote, an issue to which he has little claim to date in this House, therefore be it resolved, the member for Kings North realize that his constituents elected him to represent their views and protect their interest, not to take total ownership of the notion that, quote, silence is golden.
Notice is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a new program recently launched in City Mines hopes to improve the well-being of seniors, and whereas the Seniors Maintaining Active Roles Together, or SMART, program was developed by the Victorian Order of Nurses for seniors who can't participate in other exercise programs because of difficulties with transportation, health, or cost, and whereas this worthwhile program was designed to help strengthen and increase participants' flexibility, balance, and coordination, and relies on the assistance of trained volunteers, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House commend all those whose efforts have brought the SMART program to seniors in Sydney Mines. Mr. Speaker, request waiver and pass without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Bible Hill Village Preschool Society celebrated its 30th anniversary on Saturday, April 12. And whereas over its 30-year history, the Bible Hill Village Preschool has provided exemplary preschool activities to well over 1,000 youngsters. Whereas the community affection for the Bible Hill Village Preschool was shown when more than 250 people joined in the 30th anniversary party. Therefore, be it resolved that all members congratulate and thank the Bible Hill Village Preschool Society, all present and former staff and volunteers, for their 30 years of service to a growing community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 90 runners recently competed in the Antarctic Marathon, a competition so tough that one-third of the competitors failed to finish the race. And whereas Mark Dempsey, a Bridgewater lawyer, was one of the participants in the Antarctic Marathon, and whereas Mark finished in the top 10 in the marathon and placed 5th in the kayak race. Therefore, it be resolved that the members of the House Assembly congratulate Mark on his tremendous achievement and excellent performance at the Antarctic Marathon. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax, Bedford Basin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Halifax franchise of Boston Pizza, operated by Rick and Hank Van Polgeest, has received second place in the Boston Pizza International Inc. Standards Training Action Results and Sales Award for July to December of 2002. Whereas the STARS Award recognizes staff of individual Boston Pizza restaurants that are consistent in demonstrating excellent guest services, meeting operational standards, and continually exceeding in sales. Whereas the Halifax branch of Boston Pizza opened its doors to customers in July 2001 and has since been at the top of the Boston Pizza chain, winning a Franchise of the Year award and placing first and second in previous STARS Awards. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulated the Halifax Boston Pizza franchise owners and their staff for their exemplary work and wish them success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day or question put by members. Question period begin at 12:47 and at 1:47. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start today with a question for the Premier. You know, Mr. Speaker, since the Premier admitted defeat on Bill 68, his government has used binding arbitration to settle wage increases for nurses, for other hospital workers, for teachers, and for paramedics. Today, we are in the third week of a strike by group home counselors because the Conservatives have gone back to their Bill 68 policy, which is 2%, take it or leave it. So I'd like to ask the Premier, will he explain why his fellow citizens who live in group homes are not important enough for this government to submit the wage issue to binding arbitration?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer that to the Minister responsible.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for
giving me the chance to once again talk about how much we value the people that are cared for and community supports for adults. The amount of work that has gone into upgrading the standards, making sure that there's a consistent level of care right across the province, and commensurate with that to make sure that those service providers have the proper training, and with the sector that we've actually increased the amount of funding in that area by about 50% over that 4-year period, and that we've also placed a very significant offer on the table, which has been accepted already by a number of the unions providing services in that sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, this is not a community services issue. This is an issue of government-wide policy, and specifically policy on public sector wages. The man who has defined and enforced the government's wage policy is the Premier. He decided that hospitals and schools merit the stability of binding arbitration on wages. So I'd like to ask the Premier to tell all Nova Scotians why his government will not agree to binding arbitration for those who serve the vulnerable men and women who live in group homes.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister responsible.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to go on to point out that there is a collective bargaining process that is ongoing, and I would tell you, Mr. Speaker, from recent past experience in another ministry, it's very important to respect that process, and that is what we are doing as a government. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the measure of any society is how we treat the most vulnerable among us. The treatment of the group home residents and their families by this government is quite simply a disgrace. Absolutely. Even their employer says so. The Premier belongs to a caring profession, and yet his government has bullied the caring professionals who dedicate themselves to group home residents. So my question is this: how can the Premier justify his policy of second-class treatment for people and families who have demonstrated that they are first-class Nova Scotians?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister responsible.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, just to put a little more substance into this, that increase that of approximately 50% over the 4 years amounts to $28 million. And in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, yes, there have been increments that have been offered of 2, 2, and 2, but in addition to that, there's been a pension plan that's been put on the table, and there's been an enhanced benefits. And this is all going to the sector, and it has been accepted by other service providers in that sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Last evening, Mr. Speaker, the parents of the residents of the small options homes operated by the Regional Residential Services met, and Mr. Speaker, you couldn't help but be moved by these residents. These residents are upset and confused, and they just want to go back to their homes. And the parents can't help to be upset and angry at this government's failure to do anything about this situation. My first question to the Premier: will this Premier please tell the workers and the families in the gallery and those that are outside this legislature and explain to them why he doesn't care about our most vulnerable residents?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite correctly identifies the fact that during this period of negotiations that many residents are not receiving the kind of care, the good care that they may be receiving when the regular workers are there. But we are in a situation, Mr. Speaker, that it is a union-employer negotiation. There are rules that are set up. There is a legality here that must be adhered to, and we are adhering to the legality.
The Honourable Member for Clare on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we see this Premier daily bragging about the virtues of the Blue Book. But you know, Mr. Premier, governing is all about caring for people not checking off lists. Governing is about taking care of our most vulnerable citizens, not uprooting them and creating chaos in their lives. Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised that as a family doctor, this Premier hasn't shown one shred of compassion or concern as to what he and his government is doing to these very special, vulnerable citizens of our province. And again to the Premier, will the Premier agree to meet with these families today so to get a better understanding of the very serious concerns that they are experiencing at this time?
The Honourable the Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Clare, and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Premier for that commitment.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't want to have to resort to the Blue Book because this is what's leading the Premier to be so stubborn in the first place, but I will. On page 37, it states, and I quote, "Nova Scotians are a compassionate people who firmly believe their government must work to enhance the quality of life for all people, including our seniors, including our children, and those Nova Scotians who are physically or mentally challenged." My question to the Premier, why won't the Premier do what Nova Scotians would want him to do, provide the resources so that our most vulnerable residents can get back to enjoying the quality of life they miss so much?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite has quoted a very poignant part of the commitments we made to the people of Nova Scotia, and we will keep those commitments.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, yesterday this government demonstrated its weak grasp on health issues surrounding SARS. The Minister of Health's display yesterday of backtracking and flip-flopping over her announcement did anything, Mr. Speaker, but inspire confidence in the ability of this government to respond to this very important issue. So I would like to ask the Minister of Health if she could tell us what consultations did the Minister have with federal or provincial officials yesterday before charging ahead with her comments on the travel advisory which have so offended the Mayor of Toronto and the Ontario government.
Good question.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, yesterday morning, after the World Health Organization issued its advisory, I spoke with officials in my own department, and we attempted to contact Health Canada to see if they had any comment to make on what the WHO had issued. And at the time that I came to the House, read the statement, had gone through question period and so on, the Health Canada had still not replied to that request. So, Mr. Speaker, I gave the House the best information that I had after consultation with the Deputy and the medical public health person in our department. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Well, surprisingly, Mr. Speaker, if I can translate that, the answer was no one. Mr. Speaker, she decided to go charging ahead without consulting with her colleagues. Now the Minister is talking about sending doctors and nurses to Toronto. Healthcare workers, Mr. Speaker, as you know, are dedicated professionals. They know their jobs, can sometimes place them in contact with serious infectious diseases like SARS. But they want to be confident that this government fully understands the matter and has a plan in place that offers them the most protection possible under the circumstances, and they want to know things like whether or not their wages would be covered in the event that they ended up in quarantine. So my question to the Minister of Health is, will she inform the House of her plan to deal with any Nova Scotia healthcare workers who might contract SARS?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, first of all, I had been quite clear, Mr. Speaker, that we would not prevent people who wanted to volunteer from going. But the first step, Mr. Speaker, of the plan is to consult with the Medical Society, with the Nurses Union, with the NSGEU, and with our district health authorities. And that meeting will be taking place tomorrow morning. It is only after that meeting and consultations with the people who may be involved that we will be making any decisions on how many, if any, people we would encourage to go to Ontario. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wanted to follow up with the Minister to ask this very simple question. Given that there has been such a lack of consultation in this matter, and although she's just said that she intends to consult with workers, we want to be certain that the people of this province are also protected. So my question for the Minister is this. Will she assure the members of this House that however many health professionals go to respond to this very great need, that the people of Nova Scotia will still have sufficient medical staff to see to it that their needs are covered and that waiting lists will not continue to be expanded?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we all know that there are shortages of healthcare personnel across the country, Mr. Speaker. And if it is determined that we are able to help Ontario in some way, then we will do so. But Mr. Speaker, the House and the public can be assured that all possible protection will be afforded our healthcare workers and the public of Nova Scotia, which is, after all, the first concern of this government. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question, Minister of Health. Today we heard concerns expressed from those working in the health profession who seriously question whether we have the resources in Nova Scotia to enable nurses and physicians to be sent to Ontario to help with SARS. While we realize there's a critical situation going on in Toronto and we would do anything to assist, we have before, the reality is, Minister, to do so compromises the ability of nurses and doctors who remain back here to treat patients in Nova Scotia. Madam Minister, many are saying that we just don't have any excess resources to send. My question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, is will she indicate whether she made a personal commitment to send nurses and or doctors last evening on the conference call, and if she did, how many?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it was decided during that conference call that the first thing that needed to be done was that Health Canada would have to coordinate the requests from Ontario and possibly also from BC to find out exactly what numbers of personnel they were looking for and in what areas. And Health Canada agreed to do that. We have not yet received an official list of what is needed, but what we are doing is proceeding to consult with the various medical professionals to see what might possibly be available when we actually get that official request for numbers of personnel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
So I can assume that the Minister made no commitment last evening to send any of health personnel from Nova Scotia to Ontario. Mr. Speaker, we're committing resources, and if we do, that we certainly don't have an excess in this province. And in the Capital District alone, they're attempting to fill 7 registered nurses in positions such as emergency department and intensive care units. And I'd like to table 3 pages of vacancies for that profession. So this does, when you look at lists like that, Mr. Speaker, this does speak to the shortage that we're experiencing. And my question is to the Minister, if the nurses and physicians do go to Ontario, how does she intend to support the workers who remain in Nova Scotia so that the health needs of Nova Scotians are met? What's the plan to assure continued care for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the question that the member for Dartmouth East asked is precisely the question that is going to be discussed around the table tomorrow and perhaps in discussions afterwards with various personnel across Nova Scotia, because obviously looking after Nova Scotians is of utmost importance to us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we're not only dealing in this situation with the challenges facing when our healthcare workers would leave Nova Scotia and go to Ontario, but we're dealing with the issues of when they return. And it'd be absolutely mandatory that they be placed in some sort of isolation if, in fact, they have been working in high-risk areas. And certainly a failure to do so would place their co-workers and patients and the people of Nova Scotia at even higher risk. So could the minister please table or share with the House today the detailed plans so as how our system will function should nurses and doctors go to Toronto, and how it will function, importantly, when they will return? Surely they just can't be leaving this to Health Canada. There must be a plan within this province. Would the minister share this with the people of Nova Scotia? Because I think the minister has to have a clear message and not be changing message 2 or 3 times a day or every second or third day.
And Mr. Speaker, the plan will be developed in consultation with healthcare professionals. This plan, the detailed plan, is obviously not available now because it has not been developed yet, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I will say, however, that all or any healthcare personnel coming back from Toronto will be treated appropriately in accordance with all the protocols that are now in place or may be in place at that time for the treatment of people who may have been exposed or were exposed to SARS. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Staff at the Regional Residential Services Society are entering their 3rd week of job action, and so far the province has shown a complete lack of will to resolve this dispute. The NSGEU, which represents the workers, asked to enter binding arbitration before a strike was called, but our RSS refused. They refused because the province has given them a strict cap on wages and they had nothing else to put on the table. I asked the Premier, your government wouldn't meet with the families last night, so they came to you. Will you commit today to take action to resolve this labor dispute?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, and I refer that to the minister responsible.
Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that we've perhaps covered this ground before, but here we go again. Mr. Speaker, we have put substantial new resources into funding the sector in the idea that it's very important to care for those that are most vulnerable in society. This has been done, Mr. Speaker. Not only have the resources gone into wages and benefits, but they have also gone into increasing the training, so ultimately we are serving those for which we have community supports for adults programs, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my questions have been to the Premier simply because the Community Services Minister has continued to beat around the bush on his responsibility. So I do hope the Premier will respond. Mr. Speaker, the Premier won't accept responsibility for this issue. But the families expect his government to step in.
Right.
As one family member writes, I urge you, Mr. Premier, to take personal responsibility for the welfare of residents of small option residences, to ensure their caregivers a salary commensurate with their skills. Clearly, families are looking to the government, that's you, Mr. Premier, the one that holds the purse strings, to end this strike. My question to the Premier is how much longer do you plan to let these families down by ignoring their situation?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I am actually personally aware of some of the residents who are involved because of the negotiation between the employer and the employee. And this particular MLA, this particular Premier, will be very happy when the process is finally over and those workers are back to work.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your final supplementary.
Doctor tone, Jerry, there it is.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Then the Premier can take action. Mr. Speaker, family members are reporting behavioral changes in these vulnerable residents. Mr. Speaker, behavioral changes in these vulnerable residents. They are not coping well with the stress of this job action, and the unwillingness of this government to live up to its responsibility is dangerously close to negligence.
Absolutely.
Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is simple, and he should note that the families and workers are waiting in the gallery for the answer. Will your government agree to negotiating an end to this strike, yes or no?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister responsible.
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think that to be clear, what the concern about is here, first and foremost, during this difficult labor dispute, is the care of the residents. That is what this is about. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know the families are concerned about the residents. We're concerned about the residents. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, I would tell you that those that are walking the picket line have those same concerns. Mr. Speaker, this is an unfortunate side effect, and a serious one, of this breakdown in negotiations. But, Mr. Speaker, the department does provide care coordinators that go in, they meet with the residents, they meet with the families, they talk with them, and they try to do all they can to make sure that the appropriate care is available to the residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the Valley Regional Hospital continues to struggle with surgical cancellations due to a lack of bed, inadequate operating room time, and equipment problems. In March, surgery was cancelled outright for several days over some of these issues. Mr. Speaker, in 2001, the number of surgeries cancelled due to bed shortages was 63, but it doubled in 2002 to 125. I want the minister to admit what is now obvious, that under this Tory government, cancelled surgeries due to lack of beds has doubled since 2001 in the Valley region.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the question is similar to one that was asked the other day by a colleague concerning cancelled surgeries in Cape Breton. And certainly I will look into the numbers mentioned at the Valley Regional. But I would say, Mr. Speaker, that while those numbers were correct in themselves, they left a misleading impression. Mr. Speaker, there were 311 cancelled surgeries in Cape Breton out of a total of 20,000 completed surgeries, Mr. Speaker, with a cancellation rate of 1.5%, which is lower than the national 3% average. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Halifax Needham on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister full knows that of the surgeries that were cancelled in Cape Breton, more than 50% of them were cancelled because of the lack of beds and in-hospital problems, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I will table information from the Valley Regional Hospital outlining the cancellations and the dramatic increase in this government's mandate. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health can talk all she wants about her $1 million plan to help the Valley Regional. But the reality is it fails the real reason for the problems. In 2002, surgical services at Soldiers Memorial Hospital were reduced and medical beds were closed. This was done in spite of a rising number of surgeries canceled because there weren't enough beds. I want to ask the Minister of Health, why do you continue to ignore the impact of rural hospital cuts and the impact they're having on regional facilities?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we well recognize the issues with the surgical beds in the Valley, and that is one of the reasons that we're looking at a plan to try to meet the needs. Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, what we are trying to do with some of the treatments in rural areas of the province, Mr. Speaker, is what the department calls repatriate some services from Halifax. And in that way, we are beginning to be quite successful, and we will continue to be successful. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the plan doesn't seem to be working. There's a lack of evidence. Mr. Speaker, what is perhaps the most troubling in this very troubling situation is that many of the surgeries are major in nature, and they involve seniors, Mr. Speaker. Twice the people requiring surgery were sent packing last year because this government refuses to acknowledge the Valley Regional Hospital is in real trouble, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister of Health is simple. Why do you continue to allow cuts to rural hospitals in the Valley while surgical cancellations in Valley Regional continue to climb?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, while we do recognize there are issues involving surgery and wait times and other issues with health care across this province, including in urban areas of the province, Mr. Speaker, our government does not wish to focus on surgical cancellations, but surgical completions. And as I said earlier, our cancellation rates in Cape Breton alone are half those of the national average. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, in a speech to the Greater Halifax Partnership, Maclean's magazine editor Ann Dowsett-Johnson stated that post-secondary education funding must be taken more seriously in this province. And during that speech, Mr. Speaker, she warned the level of post-secondary education funding in Nova Scotia was almost preposterously low, and that we could not continue to take a back seat in funding. Mr. Speaker, this government just doesn't get it. Education is not a cost. Education is an investment. It's an investment for the universities. It's an investment for the province. It's an investment for the students of this province. My question, Mr. Speaker, when will this minister and this Conservative government begin to see that post-secondary education is an investment in the economic future of this province and not just a cost?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. The facts are, Mr. Speaker, that the funding for universities in this province did become preposterously low in 1978-79, or 1997-98, I'm sorry, when it reached a level of $175 million. And, Mr. Speaker, we have restored funding to this year's up to the level of $207 million, and we will continue to support our universities in that manner.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, as I said it, this government just doesn't get it. The minister need do nothing more than look up and tell high school students that they're going to have an affordable post-secondary education in this province in the future, Mr. Speaker. Tell that to the students in this gallery today. Mr. Speaker, our economic future is dependent on having a highly skilled, well-educated workforce, and to secure that future means we have to invest meaningfully in post-secondary education. My second question to the minister, Mr. Speaker, knowing that the province's economic future requires a well-funded post-secondary education system and a skilled workforce, when will this government improve funding so that our universities can become the driving force for economic development?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable member is quite correct. It is necessary for us to improve post-secondary education in this province. That's why we as a government took the initiative to provide $123 million for the expansion of the Nova Scotia Community College. That's why we have restored funding to universities, and we will reach the level where they were before they started reducing that level of funding. That's why we've come forward with a debt reduction program for students in this province that will allow them to recoup up to 40% of their debt, more than 40% of their debt, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to support post-secondary education in this province.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this province lags behind all of the other provinces in investments in the university sector. That's a fact, and that minister knows that fact, Mr. Speaker. According to statistics, the staff and students of the province's post-secondary universities inject close to $1 billion into the economy annually. $1 billion. Mr. Speaker, my final question for the minister. When is he and the Conservative government going to get it? When are they going to begin to adequately and meaningfully invest in our universities so underfunding doesn't erode our post-secondary infrastructure and force companies and students to move elsewhere, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is that that group over there, when they were the government of this province, they reduced funding to universities by down to $175 million. They did that in a failed attempt to balance the budget of this province. We balanced the budget, and we're restoring funding to universities, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member Sackville-Cobequid. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This government talks all the time about the potential for offshore development. As a coastal province, we certainly have many people who are working at sea. There will be times, unfortunately, however, when these workers will become injured or they'll become seriously ill. In a world of emergency services, we often hear about the golden hour. That refers to the critical need to transport the patients to medical services urgently required. This increases survival rates and reduces lasting impacts. We do have an excellent medical evacuation system, but there remains a serious gap that must be fixed now. And through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister of Health, will the Minister of Health inform this House of any steps she is taking to develop a helicopter landing facility close to the QE2 that is capable of handling the larger helicopters used by the offshore and by our military?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to refer that question to the Minister of Labour.
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to take that question under advisement and provide for the honourable member a complete answer.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously the Minister of Health thinks she's Premier because she's deflecting the question now over to another minister. Mr. Speaker, it's not only those who work in the offshore. We have military search and rescue helicopters that often, Mr. Speaker, are having to transport those who are on merchant ships or fishermen, Mr. Speaker, who become ill or become injured at sea. It's not only about the offshore oil and gas industry. Mr. Speaker, the new helicopters used by the military and some of those by the offshore weigh up to 30,000 pounds. But the helicopter port at the QE2 is only capable of handling those up to 16,000 pounds. At least one property suitable has been identified where a helicopter port has been, could be located, and I'm sure there are some other ideas as well. Development and operating costs do not appear to be prohibitive. What is lacking is a commitment and leadership that needs to happen, Mr. Speaker, in order to ensure that the helicopter is built, or pad is built. So I want to ask the Minister, will you take the lead and ensure that the parties involved are brought to a common table so that we can move forward in an early and timely fashion to bring this to a conclusion?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I was aware of the issue, but I'm not aware of details of any discussions or plans, so I will take that question under advisement and I'll report back to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member Sackville-Cobequid on your final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So the Minister is aware, but she doesn't have any information, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, after a crisis happens, it's amazing how issues crystallize. And over time, Mr. Speaker, and I hope it never does, but unfortunately, it is likely at some point in time there will be a need to have a helicopter pad close to the QE2 to transport somebody with one of the offshore helicopters or one of the military helicopters. And Mr. Speaker, unless it is there, we could have a loss of life or certainly, Mr. Speaker, an injury that is going to be a medical emergency that cannot be properly addressed. I want to ask the Minister, since he doesn't have any information now, don't bother deflecting this one, but will you undertake as an immediate priority to have constructed the required helicopter pad on the Halifax Peninsula to accommodate the larger helicopters that will be used in such medical evacuation procedures.
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I make that commitment, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make myself.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Before making such a commitment, I am going to obtain details of discussions that have already taken place regarding this issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Now, Member Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. In releasing Learning for Life, also known as the Tory Education Blue Book, this government showed its first sign of life in the education field in this mandate. Suddenly, Mr. Speaker, they're trying to convince us they rediscovered that education is important. We all know the pressure classroom teachers are under, and this government has given them no new supports. Instead, they've had cutback after cutback. But last week, miraculously, this government sent out a press release saying there are 127 new, that's the key word, new teaching positions being filled this year. So my question to the Minister of Education, Mr. Speaker, is will you confirm for this House that there will be, in fact, with no false accounting or fancy accounting, 127 more teachers in Nova Scotia classrooms this fall than there currently are on this day?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker, and that is certainly our intention. We have increased funding for our education and our school system this year, and part of that commitment, of course, is to increase the number of teachers, and we will be following through on that commitment.
The Honourable Member for Health, Timberley Prospect, on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this government's education policy is very simple. To get something, you got to give something up. That's why they're telling universities, and now they're doing the same with school boards. The province clawed back $6.4 million from public school funding this year because of enrollment declines. This is equivalent to between 122 and 132 full-time teaching positions. By my arithmetic, that either leaves boards with the status quo or a cut in the number of classroom teachers. So will the minister tell this House how he expects the quality of education to improve when his department is forcing boards to cut teaching positions?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to point out to the honourable member and to members of the House that indeed, as student population declines, the requirement for teachers maintaining or even lowering the student per teacher ratio will result in less teachers in classrooms because there are fewer students. However, we have made a commitment to address the objectives of our Learning for Life initiative in this province, and by addressing that commitment, we will be increasing resources, i.e. teachers and other people, in order to meet those commitments, as well as to meeting the commitments with respect to classroom size in primary as we move forward with our commitment for primary 1 and 2.
The honourable member for Timberley Prospect on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, some boards have already indicated they may even have to go beyond this and cut back even more, and I will table for you this from the Cape Breton Post. Strait District will have 15 fewer teachers next fall. 15 fewer teachers next fall. This government says their $5 million investment will mean 127 more teachers in the classroom, yet their $6.4 million cutback will actually mean less. How can the ministers say that students will be better off next school year in this province than they are this year when his government is cutting back on classroom teachers across this province?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that the population of this province, school-age population of this province, is declining. And as a result of that decline, and even maintaining student-teacher ratio, there will be less teachers required in order to deliver the program. But we have, in fact, added additional resources to meet our commitment with respect to class sizes. We have added additional resources to meet our commitments with respect to special needs students in classrooms, and we will continue to meet our commitments with respect to teachers. And I can only assume, Mr. Speaker, that following the logic of members opposite, they would continue to keep the same number of teachers in the classrooms until such time as we had more teachers than there were students, following their logic.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Environment and Labour. Mr. Speaker, a recent media report in the Chronicle Herald reports that more than 5,000 young Nova Scotians are injured every year, specifically in the last 2 years, more than 5,000 per year in the last 2 years. This is an increase of 5% since this government was first elected. What specific action is the Minister and the Conservative government taking to reduce this trend?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I truly appreciate that question because it is a tremendous problem, and it's not only a problem in Nova Scotia, it's Canada-wide. In fact, it's probably worldwide. The younger workforce coming into factories or into any type of occupation increasingly are suffering the greatest amount of injuries that impact on our workers' compensation system. And I would suggest to the honourable member that we recognize the problem, and we are certainly increasing the emphasis on education for the younger worker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, just monitoring is not good enough, quite frankly. Doing something about it is the issue. The fact that there are 5% more students, young Nova Scotians, being injured today than there were when the government first got elected is an indication that they're not succeeding in that program. Perhaps they should adopt, perhaps they should adopt the safety programs that are just initiated in British Columbia. But, Mr. Speaker, my next question to the Minister is, how are Nova Scotia businesses currently being monitored to ensure the proper safety techniques are being implemented to protect our young Nova Scotians?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised that the honourable member does not consider education to be a worthwhile pursuit for the Occupational Health and Safety Organization in controlling the number of incidents involving younger workers, because certainly that is, I think, the primary thrust that we should be taking. With regard to monitoring the workplaces, Mr. Speaker, we are continuing our monitoring process as we have in the past, and we will continue in the future.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if education alone was the answer, we would have less injuries in the marketplace, not more. So I believe the Minister is quite erroneous in what he states here today. Mr. Speaker, the fact that over 100 high school students attended a youth safety symposium last month in Halifax, it was amazing to discover that many of these students were unaware of their safety rights and responsibilities in the workplace. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister plan to hold a youth safety discussions program or initiative across the province so that all young Nova Scotians can have access to the same safety information and safety programs that the Minister so aptly refers to in his educational program?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, the success of this government in creating opportunities for young people has created more spaces in the workplace for young people. And in consequence, Mr. Speaker, obviously the rate of incidents and accidents occurring to the younger population is going to increase. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, I still say that it is a worthy endeavour of government to educate the workforce, particularly the younger workforce, in in activities that will reduce the accidents in the workplace.
Gentleman member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be directing my question to the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, last January, Rick Osborne had a feeding tube put in place because he suffers from ALS. Despite support from physicians and caregivers, Community Services forced him out of Link House, where he had been living. The family was advised by Community Services to appeal the decision, and were told that however the appeal went, the Community Services would support it. Well, they appealed, they won, and they even got approval from the fire marshal for him to return. So with bags packed, Rick made ready for his return to Link House on Wednesday, which was yesterday, but the family found out on Tuesday that it had been put off. So I asked the Minister of Community Services why he was seen fit to place another roadblock at the 11th hour.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I have to start by saying it's not appropriate for me to discuss the specifics of a particular case in the House, but I would like to speak in generalities as to the policy which might provide the member opposite with some assurance. Mr. Speaker, first and foremost, our concern is for the health and safety of all those that are in the care of the minister. And in this particular case, Mr. Speaker, for which I cannot speak, I would say that maybe a better way of putting it, in cases where there's a rapidly changing physical conditions, that before we would put them back into similar circumstances, we'd have to be confident that it was in the best interest of the health and safety of that resident. And I would suggest that that is our primary concern, the health and safety of the resident.
The Honourable Member for Hants East on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that's what the appeal was for, to determine that, and they won the appeal. Right. Mr. Speaker, on January 22nd, I attended a meeting with the family, their lawyer, community services staff, and the department gave the service provider 24 hours to put in place 24-hour LPN care, an RN supervisor twice a week, and additional staff, which they couldn't meet. Now they are requiring a lower level of care than they did in January. But Community Services is now waffling on whether they want to fund the lower cost of care at Link House. So my question to the Minister, why is your department flip-flopping on funding for Rick's care when it's now at a level less than your department demanded in the first place?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Again, Mr. Speaker, without specifically referring to the case, I would just say that the policy would be to work with the family, to work with, and clearly with the resident. And I would assure the member opposite that we would intend to honour the decision and the appeal, and that we would be working towards accommodating that decision.
The Honourable Member for Hants East on your final supplementary.
What does that mean, Mr. Speaker? We intend to accommodate the decision. Mr. Speaker, this is a party that just endorsed an expenditure of $68 million to buy the goodwill of voters. They paid $400,000 to the failed Orenda Recep. They offered Sobeys $3 million in tax rebates like they really needed it. But they can't find $250 a day for Rick Osborne to return to Link House. So I'm pleading to the minister to step in and show some compassion in this case and allow Rick Osborne to live where he feels at home. Will you commit to do that today, Mr. Minister?
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, with the difficulty of being asked questions about a specific case is a little frustrating, I would say, as the minister, because I would like to answer the member's question, but of course it would not be appropriate in this setting, other than to again assure the member that it is the department's policy to honour the outcome of appeals, and we are, of course, working to do that, working with the families that are affected by the decision.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health. Several weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, the Minister released a document titled Your Health Matters. In this document, the Minister talks about how additional money provided to district health authorities will be used to hire more nurses and doctors and shorten wait times. And I note with interest an article in the recent Bridgewater Bulletin where the CEO for the South Shore District Health Authority indicates that once you factor in salaries and the program transfers from the department, the increase to his district health authority amounts to $531,000, not $1.5 million. I'd like to table that comment in the Bridgewater Bulletin. My question simply is to the minister. How does she expect the South Shore District Health Authority to hire more doctors and nurses and shorten wait times with $531,000 for that district health authority?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I haven't seen that particular article. Certainly I will take a look at it. But Mr. Speaker, the one point and 1 point alone would be that the 7% increase is, that are going to the district health authorities are only for non-staff matters, and that the salaries will be provided to the DHAs above and beyond that 7%, and also that not all salaries have been negotiated yet. So until I look at that article, that is what I would say in answer to that question. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
It's interesting how the various stories on various very important critical issues change this minister. It was stated in Your Health Matters that the department has committed to funding increases of 7% each year for hospitals and other services provided by district health authorities. That's pretty clear, Mr. Speaker. She further went on to state that this would be in addition to what is already provided for salaries and negotiated salary increases. The minister has failed on both accounts. The South Shore District Health Authority saw an increase of 2.8%, and the salaries and salary increase are included in the $1.5 million increase. Question to the minister: why did the minister state in Your Health Matters that the district health authorities would have 7% increases and that additional money for negotiated salary increases would also be provided, when it's simply not true, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And certainly the reason we said that we would be providing 7% plus salaries is because that's precisely what we're doing. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member of Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Well, the people in Nova Scotia and the South Shore area, they wouldn't see too many new nurses and doctors or shorter wait times with $531,000 for that district health authority. And why does the minister see fit to continually mislead Nova Scotians into believing that there will be, or there are more nurses, more doctors, and shorter wait times, when it's clear that the increase will simply fund service and programs as they currently exist, particularly in that South Shore region?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, obviously the goal of providing additional money to district health authorities is first and foremost to preserve the most valuable services, and then to add on other valuable services such as more doctors, nurses, and shorter waiting lists. And that is the plan, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we stated so in Your Health Matters. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to draw the attention of the Minister of Economic Development to the former employees of the Dartmouth Marine Slips who are sitting in the gallery. These men have been fighting for fair treatment now for almost 3 years, ever since the Irving Shipbuilding shut down operations in the Dartmouth Marine Slips in June of 2000. In February, Irving Shipbuilding announced that they were shutting down the shipyard effective June 2002, and now the former employees have learned that the company has no plans for paying them severance. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask the Minister of Economic Development and point out to him that he has the power under the Industry Closing Act to ensure that these workers gain the severance they are due. My question is this: will you, Mr. Minister, make it clear to Irving Shipbuilding that they must pay severance?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member is indeed correct. On February 20th, we did receive notice under the Industry Closings Act from Irving that they'll be closing the Dartmouth Marine Slips. The member is also aware of correspondence that has been going back and forth between his office and ours. And Mr. Speaker, Irving is being required to follow due process. That's what they're doing. And if there's anything requiring government intervention, we'll deal with it at that time.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no one wanted to see the shipyard shut down operations, but in June 2000, it did. Immediately, more than 100 people were out of work. Many of these employees had worked in Nova Scotia's shipbuilding industry for more than 20 years. The Minister of Economic Development knows that he has the power to ensure that these employees are treated fairly. He knows that Irving Shipbuilding notified his government more than a year ago that the Dartmouth marine slips were closed in June of 2000. Minister, the men in the gallery want to know, why won't you do the right thing, invoke the Industry Closing Act, and ensure fair treatment?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, a point very important. A large number of people that worked the Dartmouth marine slips, as the member would know, also worked with Irving on the Eric Roud and other projects. So we're actively involved in other Irving-related work. And Irving indicated that that opportunity was there. Mr. Speaker, there is nothing before me that requires me to invoke anything under the Industry Closing Act.
I'm going to leave the official opposition on your final supplementary.
Speaker, more than 100 people worked in the Dartmouth marine slips when it was shut down in June of 2000. These employees never received just severance, and they have now been fighting for years for fair treatment. Now, Mr. Minister, question period is going to end in 2 minutes. I would ask you, will you make a commitment to meet with these workers when question period expires?
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I make the first commitment, and that is to table the correspondence between the Leader of the Opposition and my office with regards to the position as it relates to the Industry Closing Act and the close of the Dartmouth marine slips. Mr. Speaker, this is the first time that any such request has come forward, and obviously, Mr. Speaker, I would be happy to have a consultation, but then again, the Industry Closures Act is there for specific terms, and I'll bring those details before the House.
Member Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question as well is for the Minister of Economic Development. In every region of the province, except for the metro region, there has been a significant increase in the unemployment rate. What is the Minister's plan to reduce unemployment in rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as the member would know, just recently he was published a press release complaining about the fact that numbers in the province for employability was at an all-time high at 135,000, and complaining that 5,000 jobs were lost in the metro area, which means there's a gain in the non-metro area of this province. And Mr. Speaker, our growth strategy is at work. The results speak for themselves with 436,300 Nova Scotians working, and I'll be going across this province updating Nova Scotians in the weeks ahead to show how our economic strategy is working across the province of Nova Scotia, and the prosperity will continue in the days ahead, and indeed when this government is formed once again.
Now, member for Cape Breton West on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister, if his strategy is working, why is unemployment increasing in rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, the numbers speak for themselves. We're at an all-time high. Employment's up in this province and will continue. As we go into our tourist season, you'll quickly see it'll expand once again, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West, you have about 2 seconds. Order, please. Time allotted for question period has expired. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I move that you do now leave the chair and the House resolve in the committee of the whole House on supply.
The Honourable Member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to take a few moments to the House.
The Honourable Member allow for an introduction. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this moment, I'd like to make a special introduction in our East Gallery. We have a young member from my days back that I remember from my young days in politics, but also the son of the member from Yarmouth, Mr. Mark Hurlbert. I'd like to have him recognized and stand beside his father in the Upper East Gallery.
Certainly welcome this special gentleman to the gallery today. We hope you enjoyed the proceedings. The Honourable Member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, and I welcome Mr. Hurlbert Jr. Just keep him up there so he doesn't bother me during my comments. How's that? I have a few comments to make on some positives, and I know that members opposite often say that the NDP is always so negative, but I want to deal with some positive comments, and they'll begin with an event that I attended last evening in my constituency. Last evening, I had the opportunity to attend the annual meeting of the Beachville Lakeside Timberley Rails to Trails annual meeting. And it's always such a privilege to attend that meeting, to see Eric and Catherine Cleffens, to see Lindsay Gates, and to realize of the very positive contributions that they have made to our community. I want you to know that one of the key roles in the growing Timberley Prospect area is the fact that we can call upon numerous volunteers to step up and get involved with issues in our community. And over the next few weeks, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to have the opportunity to attend various annual general meetings of homeowners associations throughout my constituency. There are a couple of them that I would like to mention at this time. In particular, the Lake of the Woods constituency with Brian Pestle and Jim Muir. If you ever want to go to a meeting, Mr. Speaker, that's well run, that has time constraints always closely put in place, and that has an agenda that's tightly controlled, there's a meeting you should go to. I also want to draw in recognition to John Theetham and Barb Shanks from the Glengarry Homeowners Association. In particular, I should point out that probably the best Homeowners Association meeting that I attended recently was the Prospect Peninsula Residents Association, chaired by an exceptional young woman named Tressa Kiley. I want you to know, when you come to an annual ratepayers meeting and there are issues that come forward, the meeting is often as good as the person who's chairing the meeting. The meeting that I attended in the village of Prospect, run by Tressa, was exemplary when it came to getting things done and people reporting back in a timely fashion. I'll also have the opportunity over the next few days to attend other annual general meetings. The one that I'm looking forward to is the Halliburton Hills Highbury Estates annual meeting. I know members opposite have heard of this growing subdivision. 700 plus homes in this subdivision. And the concerns that are going to be brought forward will be brought to this House, will be brought to specific ministers, but in particular, they will be brought to the Minister of Transportation and Public Works. There is no more glaring example in the growing constituency that I represent than to invoke the plea of the member from beautiful Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley, who said when he was on this side of the House, not a teaspoon of asphalt ended up in his riding. Well, here we are as the member in the opposition, as a member for the NDP. I am telling you that a growing subdivision such as Halliburton Hills, in particular, but I can mention St. Margaret's Village in addition. I can mention that notorious stretch of road in McDonald Lake Road. I mean, these roads are in horrendous shape. These people pay big taxes. Their assessments are going through the roof. And in return, a school bus was stuck on McDonald Lake Road. There are concerns about mail delivery in certain parts of these growing subdivisions. And in other particular areas, fire trucks will have difficulties negotiating these roads because of the potholes and the rotten shape that they're in. In return, we hear talk about a priority list. Well, the people in Halliburton Hills, the people in McDonald Lake, the people in St. Margaret's Village, they have reached their level of frustration. I hear members opposite talk about this all the time. In fact, it was the member from Queens who said that it was myself as the MLA for Timberley Prospect that was pitting rural Nova Scotia against the HRM. I want to point out to the Minister of Transportation in particular that this amalgamation disaster created by this Liberal government previously, this amalgamation disaster does not work in all areas of the HRM. When you get outside of the core and when you get into the growing areas, there is definitely a deficiency in services. And the most glaring example, of course, is our roads. And I can follow with our schools, but I'll leave that for another day. Mr. Speaker, I often mention many names in my comments that I make in this House, and I'm proud to say that I have always have permission from these constituents, many of them past students of mine, as you know, Mr. Speaker, to bring forward their particular cases. I am not going to be able to bring forward of this particular mother, because this mother was a student of mine when I was a young teacher at Sir John A. Instead, I'm going to table her letter, and it should be particularly brought to the Minister of Education's attention. And I know the Minister of Education will diplomatically handle this issue, and I will privately bring forth the name of the mother and the young man who wrote this poem. And I'm going to read it into the record, if I may, Mr. Speaker. It's entitled, "The Invisible Man." You can't see him. He's alone. It's as if he's not there. He's a no one. He's an outcast. You wouldn't bother to stare. The adults think they're smart, like they know what to do. Of course they can help people like me and like you. But what about the loner, the person who's not there? Who will look after him? Who the hell really cares? So you've teased, excluded, or thrown a fist. You will make somebody live like this. That is a poem written by a grade 6 student who has suffered from bullying, who has suffered from threats, who has suffered from physical intimidation, and the school and the principal feel that their hands are literally tied. The mother goes on in this letter, and again, the letter will be brought to the Minister of Education's attention personally, and I hope he follows up by contacting the mom. This mother writes, "In regard to physical abuse, I feel very strongly that the provincial government should be held accountable. Chronic underfunding and cuts to education over the years, while class sizes have grown and the number of special needs students has increased, has definitely had a negative impact in the classroom and in the schoolyard when it comes to being able to provide safe, supportive learning environments." As a parent, this mother has a case, and it's a real one. As the mother of a young man who suffers from taunting and bullying in a class with enrollments in excess of 35, there are no excuses. And speaking to this mother, I am clear with her to say that the even more challenging years are ahead. I hear this government and I hear this Minister of Education talk about class enrollments. And I know how important primary and 1 are. But why is there this wasteland called junior high? And I say it's a curriculum wasteland. It's that land between grade 6 and grade 10 where you sort of keep the lid on it, get as many substitute teachers as you possibly can, and you control one issue after another, day after day. And for members opposite, I want you to know, I know of what I speak. The bullying, the intimidation, the threatening in junior high has reached an unforgivable extent. But in return, what are the teachers to do? Because the teachers are in situations where, after all, we have been given directions, and I say we, Mr. Speaker, because of the previous career that I was fortunate enough to be involved in. We have been given directions on handling students and handling intimidation and handling bullying. And I'm not talking about the violent extremes. I'm talking about the nasty words that young people are being called throughout the school system in this province. Here are some of them. None of them are profane. I've removed some of the adjectives and the adverbs. How would you like this as a condemnation as you took the school bus or went out for recess or later on for lunch? You suck. You're a loser. You're not cool like us.
Order, please. Order, please. I would suggest those terms are unparliamentary, and I'd ask the honourable member not to recite them in the House, please.
And you know, I agree with you in that reading. Unparliamentary in this House. But you go to a junior high anywhere in this province. You travel on a school bus anywhere in this province, and you will hear those terms. And Mr. Speaker, I removed that adjective that's been used in so many unfortunate, guttural ways day after day after day. Mr. Speaker, this issue isn't going away. This issue has to be addressed. Currently, the Halifax Regional School Board is holding a series of workshops around the growth area that I represent. Parents go, parents plead for their case. In return, we're told the class size is too high, we can't handle all the issues, we have so many other things what we are responsible for. Well, Mr. Speaker, as you well know from your previous career, if young people do not feel safe, if young people do not feel comfortable in their learning environment, then they cannot achieve success. This is a real problem, Mr. Speaker. This is a problem that this government has to address. And that's why it is important for the Department of Education and the Minister of Education in particular to look very clearly at the junior high situation, the class size, the importance of curriculum changes, but more importantly, to delve into the important issue of bullying of young people in this province. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is no time to be dramatic. We've heard of some unbelievable cases. We've heard of an unfortunate suicide. We've heard of young people coming home and refusing to go back to school. Those are issues that have to be addressed. Teachers are asking for help. They're asking for direction. They're asking for support. And they're turning to this Department of Education and this minister. We don't need window dressing. We need real assistance. And that assistance revolves around one key factor: the size of